So we're currently doing a sermon series on the book of Revelation right now at Fellowship of Grace Church. And so I just wanted to go over a few things that I haven't had the time to go into in any depth in the sermons, or things that perhaps are a little more academic than I want to talk about in the sermons. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the four basic ways of interpreting Revelation. There are basically four different schools, you can call them, of interpreting the book of Revelation. And the first one we can talk about, I choose first because it's perhaps the most pervasive view within modern evangelicalism, and that is the Futurist view, or the Futurist camp of interpreting the book. And as you can tell from that word, it's basically, the gist of it is saying that the book of Revelation is referring to events that are in the future, that they are yet to take place. Now, of course, as futurists read the book of Revelation in the first three chapters, they generally would see them as referring to things that happen historically in the first century church there, with those seven churches that are referred to. However, it's talking about, generally speaking, and particularly the rest of the book from chapter 4 on, as pretty much exclusively talking about events in the future leading up to the final return of Christ, especially describing the events that happened during the so-called Great Tribulation period. And so futurists generally are premillennialists, which means that, and I could do another video on this sometime, but premillennialists basically believe that Christ returns first, and then there's a literal 1,000-year millennial kingdom with Christ reigning on the earth, literally. So those two views generally go together. And they also tend to interpret the book of Revelation more figuratively than, more literally than other schools of interpretation. And then there's also what we call kind of the opposite of the futurist view, which they call the preterist. And the preterist view sees the book of Revelation as referring to things primarily that have already taken place in the past. And usually preterists believe that the book of Revelation is referring mostly to events that happened in around 70 AD with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And of course, this is a very momentous and important event in history, in the history of Israel, and all these things. And Jesus, in his Olivet Discourse, he talks about and prophesies the destruction of the temple in AD 70 in Jerusalem. So it's, without a doubt, it's an incredibly important event in history and church history. So they would see that as the kind of interpretive key, or the main thing that the book of Revelation is about. And so oftentimes preterists are postmillennialists. And the reason for that is, if you kind of put all these, the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, and the negative things, and say that they were fulfilled in the past, pretty much, or mostly, almost exclusively in the past, then that means the future can just be rosy and good, and all the things that we have to look forward to in the future, which is what the post-millennial view. It's the idea that there's a golden millennium period in the future where the gospel will go out to all the nations successfully, and then Christ will return after that millennium. So they call it postmillennialism. So oftentimes the preterist view and postmillennial view will go hand in hand. which makes sense. And there's another view called the Historicist view. So the Historicist view basically believes that the book of Revelation it's a kind of history book of everything that happens between the first coming of Christ and the final coming of Christ. So it's a kind of church history thing. So with the Historicist view, this is something that a lot of the reformers believed, and they put great significance on the Roman Catholic Church, identifying that with the Antichrist and all these things, and the Pope, the papacy. But they would look at there being specific events in history that the book of Revelation is giving a kind of roadmap to. And finally, there is what we call the idealist view. And this is actually the view that I am closest to holding. And the idealist view, like the historicist view, also believes that the book of Revelation refers to events that happen between the first coming of Christ and the final coming of Christ. However, while the historicist view matches up specific events and says that each of the images and each of the things in the book of Revelation only refer to one particular event in church history and not another, the idealist would say that what we have in the book of Revelation is a repetition of patterns referring to the general events that are going to happen throughout this church age until Christ finally returns. So it doesn't, in other words, it's different than the historicist view in that it doesn't match up just one historical event to each verse in Revelation, but there can be multiple fulfillments because it's talking about ideals, which is why it's called idealism, patterns of what's happening. And so when you think about the original audience with these views, and you think about, well, the people who first received this book of Revelation back in the first century, and they're thinking about, they received this, and what were they to make of it? What significance or importance was it for them? Well, this is kind of a problem for the futurist view, because if book of Revelation is generally or primarily referring to events that are far into the future from the original audience, well, then of what benefit or what purpose was it for that original audience? It seems like the book of Revelation was given as an encouragement to suffering, persecuted Christians in the first century. So that's a kind of difficulty with the futurist view. On the other hand, if you say that the book of Revelation it's primarily referring to events that happened already in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans, then it has the opposite problem. What significance does it have for us today? And what significance does it have for the subsequent generations throughout church history? Well, obvious, and then logically, the historicist view and the idealist view don't have that problem, because because with both those views, it's talking about events throughout church history. So it can have a kind of importance for every generation of the church as we read it in a similar way. So then the question comes down to, why would we choose the historicist or the idealist rather than the other? And I think that comes down to when you look at these cycles of seven seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. As you look at those, the question is, are they talking about 7 different things, or are they talking about the same things from different angles? Well, when you look at the seventh of each of those 7 bowls, 7th bowl, 7th trumpet, 7th seal, etc., there's a kind of finality to it when you look at it. in that it seems to be describing a conclusion, a complete kind of conclusion. And so that's a pretty strong argument for understanding the book not in a historicist fashion, which would say that they are separate, talking about separate things, but rather in the idealist fashion, which says they're talking about the same general patterns from different angles. So that's my basic rundown of the 4 different views. Obviously, I'm just giving you the gist of things, and there's a lot more that could be said about that, and a lot better arguments that could be given for or against each of the views. But hopefully that helps you understand just the basics of the 4 different interpretations of Revelation.